A problem with Pascal's wager. Now, Muhammad just admitted that the Quran does talk about punishment and hell for not believing in Islam, as the Bible talks about punishment and hell for not believing in Christianity. What Pascal's wager did was it made the error of automatically assuming that if there is a God, this being will judge us by how we worship this being rather than how good we are to each other. And so the wager actually is false because it presupposes without proof that God is such an evil being, if there is a God, that regardless of how good we are, unless we adopt the right religion, we will burn in hell forever. Now, I'm sure that Pascal, who was a Christian, would not have accepted that someone is meeting the wager if they were a Muslim. And I think that the defect is whenever we say, without any evidence whatsoever other than ancient hearsay in ancient books, which we know were written by fallible men, as women weren't even involved in the writing of these books, when we say, we are certain that the ultimate force in the universe will punish you unless you adopt my religion. That is nothing but primitive exclusivism. I think we got one more. Yeah.
Thank you both. That concludes our audience Q&A. We will now proceed to the closing statements. Each person will have 15 minutes to give theirs, and we will begin with Muhammad.
You have a right to go get your notes.
Okay, why not? Why not?
Yeah.
I have a right to get my notes.
Yeah, sure.
You feel like a lawyer now.
Yeah, no, I don't want to take unfair advantage of it.
Okay.
That's 15 minutes.
15, yeah?
Yeah.
Should I start? All right, please calm down. 15 minutes left. Nearly finished. I'll start when it's quiet. Just to quickly, I'm starting now, just to quickly kind of comment on the last thing that you talked about, ancient hearsay and so on. Democracy is an ancient concept. Liberalism is an ancient concept. It's still adopted by mainstream society. That's the genetic fallacy, basically, to criticize something based on where it came from. At any rate, I found it quite interesting in the last speech that Edward had. He actually made an interesting capitulation. He admitted that 99% of things natural science can explain. That means 1% of things are supernatural. That means miracles are possible. So that is very happy. I'm happy to hear that. All right. Secondly now, what he talked about cause and effect. Now, the definition of a cause is something which brings rise to phenomena. I can cause a house to be. For example, I can build a house. Yes? I can build a house. But I can die and the house will continue to be. Yes? So I don't need to exist in order for the house to continue existing. Dependence, on the other hand, is when you rely on something else. So he made the mistake of saying that contingency, which is dependence, relies upon cause and effect. It doesn't. Which is why I didn't really mention cause and effect, to avoid this discussion altogether. Let us agree for the sake of arguments. Okay? Let's agree that there's no such thing as cause and effect. The contingency argument, the way I framed it, is still valid, because I didn't mention cause and effect at all. Let me tell you why. Bertrand Russell, interesting atheist, when he was commenting on the cosmological argument, Ghazali's argument that William Lane Craig and those other guys are making popular now in this country, it's Ghazali's argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Okay. So Bertrand Russell said, but this is the problem of composition. Because you're saying that just because there are causes in the universe, it doesn't mean that that cause will be applied to the universe. So he says, for example, just because we have mothers as part of the human race, it doesn't mean that the human race itself has mother. Imagine a wall. Like Trump likes walls. Yeah, you have a wall. Just because, this is Bertrand Russell, it's a very valid argument. He says, just because a wall is made up of small parts, it doesn't mean that the wall itself is small. He's right. Bertrand Russell was right. However, what if the wall is made up of red parts? The wall itself can be red. So the fallacy of composition is a double-edged sword. Because in order for it to be a proper fallacy, it needs to have perfect knowledge of the whole. If you don't have perfect knowledge of the whole, you can't claim it to be a fallacy. So both the theist and the atheist are in a gridlock. Because the atheist is saying, well, it can't be the small part, it can't be the big. But the theist is saying, well, the red part can make, red bricks can make a red wall. And both can be possible, but both can be argued against. You see, so this is why I use the contingency argument. Let me bring back the argument that I used. Causation, for the sake of argument, no problem. You can have causation. Let's pretend, there's no causation. Let's pretend, no problem. Let's pretend. It's possible that it can exist and it's possible that it can't outside the universe on a logical basis. However, contingency, dependence, I made an ontological argument, a mathematical argument. You have a set. Things within the set are all dependent. Yes? Now you can't have the existence of things if everything is dependent on everything else. If existence depends upon dependent things, existence would never exist. You have two options. Either there's an independent outside, or this thing itself is the independent. This series is the independent. And what is it? The independent, the necessary independent. However, is it conceivable to think of this series, if we take out D2, as different? Yes. And we said a possible existence is something which can be rearranged. Wait a minute now, this is a serious argument. I'm not going to be William Lane Craig here today. I know you're used to this. I use his debates with William Lane Craig. This is his argument. I know the weaknesses of the argument. I didn't use this argument. I want the most undercutting argument. No one can crack this argument. I've read from Plato to Leibniz all the way through to Russell. And believe me, this is the argument no one can solve. This is the uncrackable code. So he tried to crack the code by saying, well, the necessary existence should have the entailment of the dependent things. Well, I'm saying the complete opposite. I'm saying that it's impossible for it to be made up of parts and still be the necessary existence. Because a possible existence is an existence that is subject to change. So, to use this phraseology, if we look at the weight of the evidence, the totality of the evidence, where extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, we have an extraordinary evidence. We have an absolutely extraordinary evidence, which works in the mind mathematically, and works in physical reality cosmologically, and works on first principles. And we get the independent, self-sufficient one entity, which we as Muslims call Allah. That's it. What if there's a multiverse? What if there's a multiverse? No problem. Have an infinite amount of universes. Or not even just universes, because why discriminate towards universes? Creations. You need something to depend upon those things. And we said it can't be that because you can envisage taking a universe in and out. And so it's dependent upon the structure. It's over. You see here, it's important to be honest with ourselves. He's a lawyer. A lot of lawyers are referred to as liars, but he's not one of them. He's a good man. And as a lawyer, when he goes into the courtroom, he refers to witness testimony. He makes abductive arguments. like CSI Forensics, put the evidences together. It's not God of the gaps. Just in the same way as if you put food for a dog, and then you go away, and the food is eaten, you're not going to say that's a dog of the gaps argument. It's just an abductive inference, which he does every time. And if it's not that, if you don't do an abductive inference, then all of the cases he's represented have been miscarriages of justice, which I'm sure he wouldn't do. And the point here is this. The point is, when we put the totality of evidence, asking for more evidence, you know what it's like? When we've given you ontological, metaphysical, a priori, a posteriori, scientific, physical, mathematic, probabilistic evidences. It's like asking for a torch when you're in the middle of daylight. Give me a torch. But why do you need a torch, my friend? Everything around you, you're locked into the arguments. Everywhere you go, there's arguments. There's evidence, there's science, even to the extent whereby you're born with that feeling of believing in God. And then you have to socially construct, according to Justin Barrett and others, your atheism. Just like you use other social constructed ideas, like second-wave feminism, liberalism. I don't think people that wrote about liberalism were women, by the way. You were talking about what about these men? They were all men. Liberalism is written by men: John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Thomas Hobbes. I don't see any women's names there. So frankly, let's not play these games. What I will say is this. What I will say is, as Muslims, we have additional evidence. And this is the evidence from Revelation. The Quran says, غُلِبَتِ الرُّومُ فِي أَدْنَى الْأَرْضِ وَهُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ غَلَبِهِمْ سَيَغْلِبُونَ. That the Romans had been defeated in low land, nearby land. And after that defeat, they will become victorious. It makes predictions which materialize. And look at this, just as one piece of evidence. And you can look at my videos for more, but this is just one thing. When someone makes a succession of predictions of the future, what is the probability that some of those predictions will be false? If you add all of those things and you aggregate them in your total probability chart, and you ask the question, if someone makes all of these predictions of the future, like the Quran does, what's the probability that this could have been a guess? Well, there's a way of finding that out through mathematical probability theory, for example, or epistemic probability. So, frankly, we do have an argument. It's not, and by the way, there's something else here, very important. He made a good point. He made a very good point. He said that, why is it the case that miracles are confined or time-bound? He's right. For a Christian, that would be a great argument. If you say to a Christian, how comes Jesus raised the dead when we couldn't see it? Absolutely right about that. Where the Quran says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا كَافَّةً لِلنَّاسِ. We have not sent you except for, to Muhammad, all of humankind. The reason why those prophetic miracles were localized, like Jesus, or Moses splitting the sea, or whatever it may be, is because it appealed, or is meant to appeal, to that time and that people. As for the Quran, itself it claims to be the miracle. It's an auditory miracle, so that you can analyze it in any time and any place. So it's not giving an unfair advantage to the primary audience. You can try and falsify the Quran now. It gives you a way to try and do so. You can try and imitate the Quran now. It challenges you to do so. And you can try and look at those things in the Quran which claim to be happening in the future and analyze whether they did in hindsight now, because we have seen whether that happened or not. For example, these are some examples. Now, in the last 2 or 3 minutes, I want to say something important. Putting this discussion to the side. You know, Edward is one of our friends here in America. And the reason why I'm putting this in the end is because I've kind of finished everything and I wanted to say this. He works actively to promote the rights of Muslims in this country. And it's people like Edward that allow for Muslims in this country and in the West to be able to be guaranteed the same kind of freedoms, frankly, that every other person should have. And I believe that if you're going to believe in something, be consistent with it. And though maybe not in the field of atheism and God's existence, he might not be fully consistent, but in his morality, he's a man of consistency. He opposes Trump's ban on Muslims. He's a friend of the Muslims. And what I want to end off by saying here is, this is the kind of person who we're happy to have as a friend as the Muslim community here in the USA. We need... Honestly, after things like the Christchurch massacre or other terrorist attacks happening on both sides, bad things are happening, we need to be able to build bridges. I believe Edward is the man, or the kind of person Edward is the kind of person we need to be friends with, we need to invite to our houses, we need to be kind to, we need to show courtesy to, and we need to respect highly, despite religious or ideological disagreements. We will agree to disagree, but we will also agree to agree, where our interests are mutual and where we can oppose a common threat to both of our existences. Edward is consistent because he does not like arbitrariness, which is a theme in liberalism, where one community are not treated the same as another community. If there's a law and you believe in liberalism, let that law be applied to everyone. And he's done some great work. He has done some great work opposing arbitrary kinds of judgments that have happened in different states. And he was telling me about that, and really and truly, we take our hat off to him and people like him. Finally, I want to say, in my last half a minute left, that if I said anything to offend anyone here, that I apologize. That was not my intention. And that obviously this is a subject which we really feel passionate about. And as a superior to me in knowledge and experience, I want to thank from the bottom of my heart Edward's contribution to today's discussion. It's been edifying, it's been brilliant for me, and I'm sure it's been fantastic for you. You're welcome at any time. I'm sure I can say that on behalf of the university, and hopefully we can meet another day. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. The issue that Mohammed raises, again, pinning his argument on the concept of a necessary being. Remember, the problem with that is that a necessary fact cannot explain a contingent fact without introducing a new contingent fact in need of explanation. And to see why, notice that a necessary fact cannot explain a contingent fact by entailing it, because then any fact entailed by a necessary fact must itself be necessary, and this sets up the regression all the way back into the past, which Mohammed is trying to avoid. Now, with respect to my comment that 99% of all scientific discoveries will show to be natural, that doesn't mean the 1% will be supernatural. It means the opposite. It means the likelihood of anything being supernatural is very implausible. And the way I said it was that unless something appears miraculous, like the stars rearranging themselves, telling us what to do, it is a God of the gaps argument. As far as the Quran's prediction is concerned, both the Quran and the Bible have failed to make the kinds of pure predictions which would show the supernatural. Now, with respect to the Quran, it was finished in 632, but it was not codified into a final written form until 18 years later in 650 by the Caliph Uthman. And now the only earliest version we have of a 90% complete Quranic text is from the mid 8th century, which could be almost 80 years after the Quran was initially given to Muhammad. Now, another problem is with respect to translations. Every time I point out something to Muhammad about the translations that I have before me, even 8 or 9 of them, his response is he disagrees with the translation. I don't necessarily disagree that Muhammad might understand the Quran in the original Arabic far better than all these translations. My argument is from divine hiddenness. If the Quran is God's ultimate revelation to humanity, it is inconsistent with that purpose for us who speak only English not to have a reliable translation. Muhammad was not able to demonstrate how an immaterial, incorporeal being created time and space. See, what Muhammad was trying to do as a valiant attempt was to rescue some vestige of the supernatural from a purely natural universe, and ultimately it was unsuccessful. He was not able to refute at all my argument from evolution. He did not refute my argument from evil. He was not able to explain how an all-powerful God that can prevent a lot of evil still has to allow so much evil. He did not adequately refute my argument from divine hiddenness because he was not able to give a reason why a God who wants us to know his will would withhold the very evidence that we need to be able to believe in that God. I, as an atheist, gave you clear examples of the type of miraculous occurrences which would make me turn into a believer. In fact, if my dead father appeared right now, transported Muhammad and me to Mecca, and told me, and I knew it was my dad, that since dying he realized that Islam was the perfect religion, I would convert right away. So I'm subject to and open to the evidence. The other thing that Muhammad did not refute was my claim that the Quran, like the Bible, demands eternal punishment for choosing the wrong religion. I believe that we human beings have a right to use our reason and sense of justice to say that it is wrong for any all-powerful deity to condemn innocent people to eternal suffering because of an honest mistake in choosing the wrong religion. And so I believe to that extent the Bible and the Quran are equally false. However, I have to say the Quran did improve on the Bible in one area. If you read Jeremiah 19:9, you see that God threatens to make people eat their sons and daughters. In the Quran, there's no such vestige of cannibalism. So if God does exist, I thank him for, in between the Bible and the Quran, taking human flesh off the menu. Muhammad was unable to refute the argument against a transcendental person, because if you are a person, you have to have some boundary, some limit. To say that you are not in time and space and you are in time and space, what are we talking about? It's like some guy standing up waist deep in a hot tub. He's half in and half out. How can you be partially in time? How can God enter time? In order to enter time, you have to have a beginning in time. A timeless being cannot do anything. Either can an immaterial being. Now, I know that the concept that death is the end is very difficult for most people to tolerate. But on atheism, what's true is not what we would like to be true. What's true is what cold hard reality shows is true. There is no example whatsoever of conscious self-awareness being able to exist without a fully functional physical brain. If it were so, then Alzheimer's disease would not be able to eclipse consciousness. Again, Alzheimer's disease eclipses your consciousness, but when you die, you're fully intact in an immaterial form. It can't happen that way. Also, the argument from evolution with the common ancestry that we have with apes. We didn't evolve from apes, but we spun off and had a common ancestor. If you look at the fossil record of the precursors to Homo sapiens, who we are now, you see we evolved from a more primitive life form. Both the Bible and the Quran accept the notion of Adam and Eve. You can't have an Adam and Eve if evolution is true, which it is, because there was no such thing as the first perfect human couple. We evolved like any other creature. So if there was no Adam and Eve, both the Bible and the Quran are wrong in saying that there was. And of course, if there was no Adam and Eve, then Christianity is completely wrong in talking about the sin in the Garden of Eden. Now, another thing that Muhammad was unable to do was to demonstrate, and I've seen other Muslim apologists try to do this, was to demonstrate that the language or the mode of Arabic itself used in the Quran had to have a divine authorship. You can have advanced language or poetic or useful verse, or you can make innovations in language, but that does not show that there was a supernatural origin. Also, he failed to show us what specific predictions in the Quran were made that turned out to be true. On one of his YouTube videos, he talks about a Roman war which the Quran predicted the Romans would lose. Well, I looked it up. That war ended in 628 CE, and the Quran was finished in 632 CE. So the Quran did not predict anything in the future. The other aspect of all of this is the incompatible properties of the concept of God, the very concept of God. God cannot be both omnipotent and omniscient. If God is omnipotent, it means God can do anything, including change his mind. But if God is omniscient, he always knew what he was going to do in the very end, so he cannot change his mind. So therefore, the properties of omniscience and omnipotence are incompatible. With respect to the fine-tuning argument that sort of Muhammad flirted with and then moved away from, if we look at that, on theism, you would not need any kind of fine-tuning because God would be capable of making us live in any environment. So the whole notion of fine-tuning is nonsensical. But yet, if you look at atheism and there is no all-powerful God who could make us live in any environment, then we would need fine-tuning, because there is no supernatural being to sustain us any which way, which makes fine-tuning curiously more likely on atheism. Now, I've heard Muslim apologists say that the Quran predicted that the universe is expanding. I looked at 4 different translations, and the only one that used the term expanding was Mustafa Khattab in 2016. The 3 other translations, including the classic Pickthall and Abdullah Yusuf Ali, all of them had the vastness of space already existing. So if the Quran did predict that the universe is expanding, which meant that the Quran had divine foreknowledge before science that the Big Bang occurred, then only 1 out of 4 translations shouldn't be able to show that. So once again, on divine hiddenness, if the Quran is what God wants me to believe, then the Quran should have been translated into English true. Also, on the argument from evil, and I've touched upon this, is the distribution of pleasure and pain. On theism, we would expect that horrendous pain would only exist if there's a purpose that would aid our survival or our reproduction. So if I put my hand on the hot stove, it hurts, so I take my hand away. But let's say, again, I or some innocent animal are caught in a forest fire and we're unable to pull away from the pain and we suffer a horrible death. Well, the pain of that burning to death did not contribute to my survival or reproduction, and so on atheism it's understandable. On theism, it's not understandable. I referred earlier to the Bayesian probability analysis. On Bayesian probability analysis, which is widely used, you have to have prior knowledge of something. There's no prior knowledge of the supernatural, so if you use Bayesian confirmation predictive ability, you would not be able to predict the supernatural. If the supernatural existed, there would be evidence of it. If consciousness could exist without a functional physical brain, there'd be evidence of it. If the Bible or the Quran predicted something which could only have been known by miraculous means when it was written, there would be evidence of it. If we humans were specially created, there wouldn't be overwhelming evidence that we evolved from ape-like creatures from a common ancestor with apes. So, with all of the evidence, a cumulative case shows the universe is natural, not supernatural, and that God does not exist. Thank you.
And with that, alhamdulillah, we conclude the debate. Jazakallahu khair everyone for coming out. We really appreciate your company today, this evening. And inshallah, we can see you guys again in the future. And may Allah, can everyone give them another round of applause, because mashallah, they're both super amazing. I would also like to give a big thank you to another key organizer. His name is Abdurrahman. He did a lot of this work, and I want to give him a really big round of applause as well. And inshallah, before everyone leaves, something super important again, if anyone is able to, we are really asking for donations to help cover costs for the trip and for all the events. So if anyone wants to, there is a box for donations outside. There's also the Venmo, which is Davis MSA. And we appreciate anything and everything. Jazakallahu khair for coming, everyone. Inshallah, have a good night.